The Johnversations Podcast. This is episode number 33. And as always, I am your host, John Connor. My guest today is a civil rights attorney in Oakland, California. His encounter with the Oakland Police Department is now the subject of the short film Dead Right, which is available to stream now. Ladies and gentlemen of the internet, please welcome Mr. Adante Pointer. Adante, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy. We were kind of talking about schedules moving back and forth, but I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out for the time that you do have with us today.
Well, likewise, I appreciate you offering the time and the opportunity on your platform to talk about the issues that I hold near and dear to my heart, and that should be important to everyone listening.
No, and I certainly agree. And I will say, I actually found out about the film. A friend of our show, he's been on before, Theo Hollingsworth, did some of the directing on that film. So when he was posting about it, I was like, I got to check this out. And then I went down the rabbit hole, man, as far as like, okay, what like kind of cases and stuff like that. I know that, even through COVID and stuff like that, you've been out in the streets and marching with the people and things like that. So it's always a pleasure to have somebody on who is so passionate about what they do. And then on top of that, using what they do to help people in need. You know what I mean? So it's I don't know, it's just a blessing to have you here. And to get started, because I definitely want to talk about the film, but I want people to kind of get a sense of those things that you said, are near and dear to your heart and a sense for why you do the work that you do. Talk to me a little bit about what it is specifically that you do for people who may not know and what kind of led you to that.
Sure. Well, it's one of these things that has been a lifelong journey, if you will, in some ways. And what I mean by that is, born and raised in Oakland, West Oakland in particular, and growing up in that side of the city, I saw a lot. I saw a lot of the despair. I saw a lot of the economic degradation and poverty and so on and so forth. But I had the opportunity to go to a very affluent school in Piedmont, which is on the other side of the town, where, people are wealthy. They're doing great. They have circular driveways. They got fountains. They got 4 or 5 story houses and all the good stuff that we didn't have. And so seeing that up close, kind of living in that kind of on both sides of the street of the fence, if you will, or both sides of the street or the railroad tracks, I got a chance to really appreciate the differentiation and the distinction between the two experiences of life. So it intrigued me as to why one side of the same city could look a particular way. And if you just go 10, 15 minutes to the other side of the city, it looked a different way, a totally different way. And so that focused me up on that in the law, because I was thinking, without going too deep into the story, my best friend in like first grade, his father was an attorney. And when I went to their house, my mom finally let me go to a friend's house. It looked like the White House to me. I'm like, man, you guys, oh my gosh, like, what does your dad do? And he's like, hey, my dad's an attorney. And so that kind of put the thought in my mind about being an attorney because of the lifestyle. Not necessarily I knew what attorneys do. And then in growing up and, like I said, becoming concerned with some of the social issues, I started focusing up on being an advocate, for the community. And but growing up in West Oakland, there was a point in time where, the legacy, if you will, of the Oakland Police Department and the Black Panthers, as well as the more recent iteration of the police department dealing with the Riders, which was a rogue group of cops that terrorized the community, framed, beat, and arrested people, and were ultimately criminally prosecuted, with the head honcho of that group of cops fleeing the country to never be seen again. And so I grew up hearing these stories, seeing it, knowing people who had been abused by the police, and myself harassed by the police a number of times growing up, especially when I started driving. And so, and even to the point where I was studying for the bar exam, still living in West Oakland in my family's house, and I heard a bunch of wrestling and tussling going on outside the door. It was studying for it in the summer, so I had the door open, no AC, and I heard it through the screen door. And when I went out to look, I actually thought it was like 2 or 3 guys fighting. To my surprise, it was a guy on the ground getting pummeled by 2 police officers.
Jesus.
So, yeah, it was ironic, to be studying for the bar and see this going on right out just steps away from my home. So I called out to the cops, like, hey, this is before, and I'm dating myself, but this is before cell phones, cameras, and all this stuff.
Right. You were pulling out the iPhone to get it on camera. It was, you could play Snake on your phone, but that was about it.
Yeah, right. The screen was green and it looked like, the old school computers, so. anyway, I called out whatever, and I stopped that assault from happening. The person came back a few weeks later, or maybe a month or so later, and was like looking for the witness. I happened to be home, and of course, he was excited to see that, man, okay, not only do I have a witness, but this person's actually on his way to be an attorney. I didn't represent the man. I directed him to the person who I would later go to work with, who is John Burris, civil rights legend in and of himself. And I wound up working there. And, the point is, I guess, really is, after being there in that office, not only having the personal experience at that point in time of seeing it happen in my community, being harassed myself, but then being there and actually cracking open those case files and many case files and seeing the hard evidence of the way in which the police were treating people, has put me on a mission to stop that, to keep that from happening, and to keep families from being broken, from being harmed, from being injured, and to protect people's civil rights.
Well, and it's funny because it's such a noble thing to do. And the reason I say that's funny is I recently had a doctor on the show, Dr. TJ Webb, shout out to him, but he runs a blog for battling misinformation, medical misinformation and conspiracies around like COVID-19, stuff like that. So he's out there fighting that fight. But he said the same thing. Like, when I was younger, I saw how much money doctors made. And now he does family medicine practice where he's working with low income. So it's like, I was attracted to this thing for the potential life that I could live. But then when I got into it, I found that my values and my morals kind of more aligned with, okay, even though I'm doing this, like, let me help the people who need it the most. And I kind of sense that from your story. It's like, you think about it as, I'm going to be this lawyer and, nice cars and all this stuff. And then when you get into it, it's like, well, the most important thing is making sure that I'm helping the people that are underrepresented, and that I'm there to make sure that their rights aren't being violated. Does that sound about fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like you said, I was attracted to being an attorney because of the house that my first grade best friend, lived in. And when his mom said, "You guys want a snack?" We're like, "Yeah," just like cereal, which I was like, "Great." And we went and had like 8 boxes of cereal. I had never seen anything like that in my life. But, it wind up the arc of my interest bent towards justice and equality and fighting for those who are underrepresented in terms of having quality representation, but overrepresented in terms of getting the short end of the stick. And that's the people, and that's who I stand with. And you're right. I started practicing law. I didn't take an oath of poverty, so I'm not saying that.
Right.
But I already had a PhD in it. But I don't think that the two necessarily are mutually exclusive. You can have a great life for yourself and your family and do good work for people and on behalf of those who need it. And that's what I stand for.
Yeah, and it's almost like, like, do good, get good in return, and it's funny because I can relate to, when you said, you grew up in one area, but then going to school someplace else. When I was growing up, we lived I'm from Michigan originally. I'm in Tennessee now, but lived on John R. and 8 Mile, which is, very close to Detroit. And when I was in about 3rd or 4th grade, my grandparents helped my mom and dad buy a house in the suburbs. So we went from, the kid I knew down the street got hit in a drive-by to now I'm in like this very affluent neighborhood and nice schools. And it can be very much a culture shock to be like, well, that's, like you said, like, that's just 25 minutes away from where I live now. So why is it so different? You know what I mean? I think when you're that age, especially being young, that question can kind of imprint on you and have you continue thinking about what those differences are as you get older. Which, I don't know, maybe it's an experience where if you're fortunate enough to have that, it kind of shifts your thinking in a way that some folks who never see both sides of that coin would have that perspective.
I totally agree. I mean, so did I hear you say 8 Mile? Like,
yeah, John R. and 8 Mile. Yeah, Madison Heights. So if you went 10 minutes in the other direction, it was downtown Detroit. So,
well, 8 Mile for me. I've been to Detroit one time. I was up visiting, I think that's Wayne State, right?
Yep.
Downtown. But, I wanted to go to 8 Mile because 8 Mile's famous, Eminem and all that. So, being from Cali, I always was like, I wonder if 8 Mile is anything like around here. Is it anything like East Oakland or anything like that?
Yeah, it's in the 8 Mile movie, he does all his battles at the shelter. That's, the venue.
Right.
And watching that movie is like, I played there with my bands when I was growing up like a million times. So it was crazy to see it like
Wow.
portrayed the way it was in the movie, because it's like, oh, it really doesn't look anything like that. But they, wanted to make it more dramatic. I mean, maybe it did back then. I'm a couple years younger than Eminem, but being there was definitely, it seems like they definitely tried to make it more dramatic for the film, but it was cool because it was like, oh, I've played there. I've been on that stage. So that's pretty cool.
But did you throw up there too, or what? I mean, were you in the bathroom throwing up and stuff before you went on the stage?
No, I had a girlfriend one time that had a drinking problem, and she drank way too much and threw up and passed out on that floor. And I will tell you, that is not a floor you want to pass out. It
did not look like anything you wanted to touch. Yeah, I agree.
Oh yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you this. You had mentioned white supremacist groups in police departments, and I think California, like the Linwood raid, or the Linwood Vikings are probably the most notorious example. People may know may know about them if you've watched like the Innocence Files on Netflix and things like that. And my question to you is, I truly believe that a large percentage of police officers are probably in it for the right reasons, want to keep people safe, things like that. I don't know if maybe it's just like my inner voice, but it's saying, not everyone can be like that. But what do you think it is about that profession that allows that kind of mentality to thrive? Because it seems like the more that we learn, especially in today's climate, like, I mean, Linwood Vikings, they were tatted up. They were a legitimate gang in the police department who were just black and brown folks. It didn't matter if you did it, didn't do it. If from what I understand, it was, we could make up a crime and I need to get you off my street. So what do you think it is about that environment that kind of breeds that?
Well, I think there's a few basic principles that maybe some of your viewers have heard of. It's like absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so when you're in a situation where aggressiveness is celebrated, it's encouraged, it's tolerated, it's condoned, it's, not frowned upon, it's not disciplined. So you have people who are aggressive people who are attracted to the idea of having power over others. And then it's unchecked, it's unmonitored, and it's allowed to fester. So if you're already predisposed for whatever reason to be an abusive person, it's like the country club of abusers. Not that everybody there is an abuser, but if you are, no one's going to prevent you from carrying out the abuse, because you're carrying it out for the large part on people who are not shielded or are not listened to or not believed or who are already thought to be less than. And so, and then you're on a higher level as a police officer, you're given all these extra privileges. You're thought to like, why would they lie? Why would they do these things? Because ultimately, in terms of why it's festering, I think it attracts that type of personality type because it's celebrated, And so, and as you kind of peel the layers off the onion, you find that the onion is more rotten than you'd ever believe,
Yeah. And, I agree with that, and in my family and friend circle, like I have friends who are police officers, and it's funny too, because a lot of the people that I've talked to who are in that profession, they echo the same thing is, it's not everyone, but it's enough that it impacts everyone. And it kind of, reminds me of the adage of, if you've got 10 cops, five are using excessive violence or bad cops, and the other 5 don't say anything, like you've got 10 bad cops, so it's
absolutely.
I wanted to ask you this too. So, I mean, you are working every day on the front lines, and it seems like we see, just video after video after video after video after video, to the point where it's like, there's been sometimes where, I just like, I open my phone and it's almost like, okay, well, what am I going to see today? Like there's going to be something, and it can be so overwhelming on the soul. And then you see something like the Jacob Blake shooting, for example, where those cops are not required to wear body cams. And then you start hearing that there are cops that can turn off their body cams whenever they want to. And then if they do wear body cams, then if you dig a little bit deeper, how often is that footage actually audited? How are they checking in to see, like, what are these officers doing in these stops? Like with George Floyd, for example, I don't think we would have ever seen that body cam footage unless they were trying to use it as a defense for Chauvin's partner, right? So what are your thoughts around that? I mean, like what, in your opinion, should these, because I think that there are precincts out there that want to do better. I think the example that comes to mind is, the police chief in Flint, Michigan, that, he took off his helmet and put down, everybody put down their gear and said, "We're here to march with you." And they marched. I think there are precincts out there that want to do better, that want to be there with the community. So for those types of precincts and officers, what could they change? What could they do to better those community relations? What can they do to start weeding those people out? Because it just seems like, you can choke somebody out or shoot somebody and you get fired and you go to another precinct and they're more than willing to hire you. So, in your opinion, as someone who's battling it every day, like, what should we be doing?
Well, so that's a great question. It's a big, big, big question. But to just kind of break it down to bite-sized pieces, I think a part of it is looking at who are we talking about in terms of do what. So if you're talking about the police or the police departments, if you're like, to answer your question, how do you weed them out? Well, most police departments, at least certainly here in California, they take like a mental evaluation test, a psychological test. People who are coming in overly aggressive, inflexible, people who have, checkered past, if you will, or questionable affiliations, people who hold bigoted or discriminatory positions shouldn't be allowed into the force. You come in, because the fact is this, most police officers will never use their gun, okay? So if you've used your gun and killed somebody, you're in a small minority. If you've done it more than once, you're in a super small minority. Either, you've got the lotto ticket twice, getting it once is remarkable. Getting it twice in one lifetime, struck with lightning twice. What are the odds and what are the chances? There are things going on there that should be looked at. And frankly, if you've taken 2 lives, even 1 life, it's time to get you a desk job, or, you don't need to be on the street, even if it's a righteous shoot. Okay. Assuming that, like, the idea is, there's some baggage with that. Let's not have that person interacting with the public in that way. Okay. Right. The second thing is, fellow officers that see officers violating the oath of their duty of their office as a peace officer, and instead of creating peace, are creating, harm and ill will in the community. Those officers, we need them to do the right thing, which is to hold their fellow officers accountable. That's very important. And it's funny because this thin blue line, which is what it's called, the us versus them mentality, is what feeds into the idea that these officers have to remain silent when they see somebody, their friend, okay, their coworker, okay, see them doing something wrong. It's hard for them to step up, because just as, the catchphrase, if you will, that's attributed to people who do wrong, like snitches get stitches or don't be a snitch. Right. Well, the same thing applies to the gang mentality, if you will, of police officers in those environments. So, we need the good apples to expose and get rid of the bad apples. And we need a better screening process on the hiring end. And also, while they're there, tracking people who have a lot of complaints, tracking people who seem to be engaged in using a lot of brutality, a lot of force, a lot of stops that aren't justified, a lot of resisting arrest charges that don't have other charges associated with it. Like, those are the different things that can be done quite easily, frankly, to start clearing people, police departments, of the bad actors.
Yeah, because from what I understand, if you're a cop, resisting arrest covers like such a broad amount of like potential actions or like interactions with that police officer that they can, if you say something, they don't like, all right, buddy, you're resisting and I've got you. And then that's the only charge. And it's just a way that they, not always, but it seems like it's a way that they can just put cuffs on you and then, you're in the system. You know what I mean? And
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say you're absolutely right. It's a slippery slope. Once you start going down that rabbit hole, because if they say you are resisting, and it sounds bad, right? Resisting arrest, but resisting covers just moving too slow, not readily putting your hands behind your back. They're doing something, they're investigating something, and you're calling out like, "Hey, why are you doing that?" You're resisting, obstructing, or delaying a police officer. So now you have a charge. And let's say you're like, "Hey, man, I didn't do anything. You're tripping. All I did was say, what are you doing?" And now you're over in my face telling me to put my hands behind my back as if I'm going to get arrested or I am getting arrested. And you tense up, right? Because the average person, you're not used to, and it's a natural response to somebody putting their hands on you in an aggressive way. Like your body tenses up because you don't know what's going to happen next. Well, that's resisting or delaying. And then the law allows them to use force to overcome that. And so, it just, from there, and that's why you see what tend to be just the basic everyday maybe encounter of writing a ticket or investigating something or stopping somebody from doing something turned into a fatal encounter, because the slope is so slippery. Once an officer has focused in on you, the playbook is pretty much open to justify what they want to do to you.
Yeah. And you had mentioned something that I wanted to talk about, because it seems like the training, and I think the best example that comes to mind for me is the I forget what his name is. I wish I could remember his name, but he gets under my skin so much. I think my brain kind of pushes him out. But there's a guy who the Minneapolis police actually advocated for their officers to go to this guy's training, but he specializes in what he calls killology, and it's the idea that you are the predator. The community is your prey. You have to be ready and willing to pull the trigger. You have to, if you're not ready to take someone's life immediately and not ready to be a soldier like that, then this is not the job for you. And for me, it seems like, well, if we kind of moved away from that and invested in these community, I've talked about it before, but like Kevin Hart has partnered with Chase Bank so that they can go into inner cities and teach kids, about entrepreneurship and how to open businesses and get, and for me, it's like, well, that's a great thing, but why does Kevin Hart and Chase Bank have to do that? Why isn't this something that, local governments and giving people in Oakland, giving people in Detroit, giving people in Nashville, these opportunities to kind of better themselves and become business owners and things like that. So what are your thoughts as far as that kind of mentality? Because it really does seem, especially again, when you watch the Michael Brown video, when you watch the George Floyd video, it all these cases that everybody has seen and that it seems like become numb to. What are your thoughts around that? You're like the apex predator in this community, because to me, it makes me want to pull my hair out of my head. I'm like, that's not how this is supposed to be.
Right. Well, it's sad. I mean, the effect is death, destruction, mistrust, distrust, and us versus them mentality. When at the end of the day, you're supposed to be a peace officer, and the idea that society likes to believe and what we are told to accept is that police are there not only just keep the peace, but also to be a partner and a representative of what the community's values are. Unfortunately, what you see in the training process of police officers, and then when they're on the street, is it's us versus them, and that it's an occupying army type of idea where it's, if we're not here to patrol and be the zookeepers, or if we're not here to make sure that the inmates don't run the asylum, then all hell breaks loose. And it's like, hey, but you have to understand fundamentally that there's good people here in this. And the idea is you have a set of rules and an oath. The rule breakers, the offenders, they haven't taken that same oath. So the idea that you're going to equate yourself as having to be more of an apex predator than the person who is outside of the law, it butts heads with the idea of justice. Because if justice is about beating heads and arresting everybody, then I don't want that justice. And I think the average person wouldn't. The issue we have in our society is that until it's put in people's faces who their communities are not patrolled like that, they have no reason to believe or think that this is what's happening. And I liken that to what we experienced as a country with the civil rights movement of the 60s. And that was that once cameras and TV were in people's living rooms, you saw the dogs, you saw the water cannons, you saw the beating, you saw all of this, you couldn't deny it anymore. And that's what's kind of happening now with the cell phones and social media and some of the transparency laws that are starting to sweep the nation, is that, the evidence can no longer be ignored. You can't cover it up. It's for people to see. And that's why someone like yourself, like you're saying, every time you open your phone, you're like, what am I going to see today? Why? Because it's happening that frequently. And now there's an ability to capture it. But the last thing I'll say on this is for people to ponder is, what do you think was happening before cell phones? Mm-hmm. Before cell phone cameras? This isn't a new phenomenon. This is what's been going on. We just didn't have an ability to give you the proof.
Well, and we've talked about it on the show before, but I mean, you can go back to late 80s, early 90s and see, Rodney King. And it was just somebody happened to have a camcorder and capture that. But it's disheartening sometimes to say, like, okay, that was all those years ago. Like, there was the LA riots and where are we now? Because it doesn't feel like we're much further. So, for someone like me, it's well, how the hell much do you have to see? What has to be put into your face, or what do you have to be shown that you can't justify with, well, he shouldn't have been resisting arrest? It's something like what can I show you to illustrate that there's an issue? What will it take for that light bulb to switch for you? And I think that's the most just like infuriating thing to me is there's just some things I see and I'm like, I don't understand how you can go on Facebook or Instagram and then, well, what about Portland and all, like, just like try to defend all this stuff. It's like, it's apples and garbage cans. They're not even the same family,
Well, I liken it to, I've been practicing law and fighting these good fights, 16, going on 17 years, doing civil rights work, and particularly as a civil rights attorney. And I used to tell people all the time that it's akin to telling your kid there's no Santa Claus, assuming that, your kid believes it, right? Or you've seen a kid believe in Santa Claus, right. When at some point in time, the wool is pulled over their eyes and you as a parent are like, look, I'm not going to allow Santa Claus the credit for standing in line for 5 hours. The guy in the mall. Yeah, right. I'm eating the cookie. I'm not eating the. I'm not drinking the milk. I'm not putting this stuff all over the house and going through this elaborate thing. And the kid's looking at you bewildered, like, wait, hold on. Everybody's in on this? I mean, what about the guy in the mall? What about the reindeer? What about the cookie was bitten and the milk drunk? And I sent the letter and we did all this stuff. And there's all these people running around talking about Christmas and this imagery that I believe in and this symbolism that I believe in. And you have to look at them deadpan and be like, yeah, I was a liar. I'm sorry. Mom was in on it. I was in on it. Grandma's in on it. Everybody's in on it. You were the only person that didn't know. Right? And so it's the same thing. It's like, but now now we're being conditioned. It's funny. It's like before you're dealing with a kid who doesn't believe it because they're being exposed to it. And then the arc turns into being like, wow, okay, it's true. And then after a while, like you said, you kind of get, you can get numb to it because you're sitting here thinking to yourself, wow, this happens all the time. It's not as shocking, and for people who are refused to believe there's no Santa Claus, then no matter how many videos you show them, they don't care because they think it's just a one isolated incident. They think the person deserved it. Or if they're a type of person who doesn't like the group of people who are being treated this way, then you rationalize it. We saw this, with the way the Jewish people were treated, in Germany. We've seen this in South Africa. We've seen this all around the world. This is our, ongoing issue that is a pandemic that has never received an appropriate virus or cure.
And I agree with you. And it's just like, that's a really good analogy. I've never thought about it that way as far as I'm now when I have to, my daughter is 2 years old. So now I'm like, oh man, I'm I'm gonna have to ruin that someday. But I think you're right. I think that and that's what's hard for me too. Is it comes down to, okay, are you rationalizing this just because in your core you have a prejudice or racism towards this group of people, which allows your brain to be like, well, this is why, it's okay, and it was so frustrating to me, again, especially after the Jacob Blake shooting, where, people are like, you know, he was a rapist. And I was like, well, no, he wasn't. You know what I mean? That's just a meme that somebody put online, and then you're spreading because that's easier for you. It supports your narrative instead of saying, let me look at the facts. And he may not have been a saint of a human being, but I don't believe that not being a living saint is justification for being shot in the back 7 times in front of your kids. Like that doesn't equate to me,
Another side of it too, I think too, that, I mean, it's funny. I wonder what a psychologist would say, but this is me as a practitioner, an attorney, talking to jurors and going out speaking in different crowds and seeing the reaction and the questions. The other part of it too is to bring it down to just the most personal level is that if you believe that a traffic stop can turn into you being maced or tased or beaten or shot and killed or shot 7 times in your back, then that means that every time you see a police officer, you're scared. Mm-hmm. Every time you see, you get pulled over for your speeding ticket, you wonder if you're going to live. Now, this is the fear that many people in our society, Black and brown people and other people, live under. But when that fear then turns into reality, because you're like, whoa, any moment in time, if I'm going 5 miles over the speed limit or not, I can have an interaction that can wind up with me being injured or killed or my whole life, ruined, then it's unsettling. So we have to, in our minds, have to say, well, there must be something that person's doing, that group of people are doing to deserve it, because otherwise it forces us to have a lot of hard conversations and realizations of our own, which is that we're unsafe.
Yeah, well, and I agree with you, and I know we've got about 22 minutes left, and I want to talk about the movie as well. But I was talking to a family member, and they were, and she's got a good heart. I think they don't want to believe that the world is the way that it is, because sometimes it's easier just to be naive to it, I think. But it was, well, if you do something illegal, you should be charged. And I said, well, yeah, I agree with you, but you have to go a step further and look at the inequities as far as what those sentences look like. If, that there's the statistic that, 50% of white folks and 50% of Black people, brown people are caught with marijuana. But when you look at the number of, minorities in prison because of those charges, it's grossly disproportionate, so it's, and she was like, oh, I don't know. And I sent her an article that showed that in 2001, it showed 1 in 3 Black children or Black males born in 2001 would be in prison at some point in their lifetime, where it was 1 in 17 out of white males born in that same time. So it's if you don't live, and I hate to even say it like this, but if you don't live with kind of like that target on your back, that you have that mentality, I think it's very hard to be able to empathize or relate to that, where someone who's living that life, like you said, if you get pulled over, it's like, oh, this could be my last day. This could be the day that I go to jail, or I don't go home to see my mom, or, and I know you have kids as well. Is that, as a father, I mean, is that something that weighs on you? Is that something like that you're going to have to try to prepare them for? Like, what kind of feelings does that bring?
Ooh, the weight of the world on your shoulders, because one of the things, if you're a parent, you always want to shield and protect your child, period. And, but you also know how children can be. And just as we as an adult, you might know the rules, and, it doesn't mean you follow them every time, to the letter and to the T. And so that could bring you into police contact. And then if you're in a community that's being over-policed, then your chances of having police contact skyrockets. If you're in a community that has been deprived economic development and jobs and real educational opportunity, and instead drugs have been allowed to flood the community. Instead, hope and despair have been allowed to take hope. Then the over-policing is kind of justified, and it's this vicious cycle, right? So, and then if you're living on the other side of town, like, you were explaining when you moved, and as I was explaining, as I would go to school with, and I had that dichotomy of a life all the way from kindergarten all the way up to 11th grade. And I know firsthand that if I got pulled over, or if I was at the park with my buddies from the rich school, with my white friends and buddies, and whatever we're doing, underage stuff that you're not supposed to do, it was told, pour that out, stomp that out, and make sure you get out of here. The park is closed. There wasn't anybody being asked, are you on probation or parole? We weren't being manhandled. We weren't being roughly searched. We weren't being humiliated in that way. Whereas if I was with my other friends from the neighborhood, we almost knew the routine. They come up, put your hands up, turn around, assume the position. You're going to get frisked. Everybody has to give their name, and maybe you walk out of there without a ticket. More than likely, something negative is going to happen. And so, but that's also conditioning. And so, with those friends from the neighborhood, if we got pulled over, you're like hands on the steering wheel 10 and 2. Whereas when I was with my friends, from the affluent side of town, it's like, officer, why are you pulling me over? What did I do? Justify yourself. So it's a way of looking at the world as well. So it weighs on you, because as a parent, that you're not going to be with your child all the time. And so they can find themselves in a situation very quick that goes from it being, I'm being pulled over from a speeding ticket, to it being Sandra Bland, to it being any one of the other too long list of names of people who either had their life ruined because they were sent to jail on some false charges, beat up and had injured or killed. And so, man, it's one of those things where you have to prepare your child for the reality of the world. And it's a sad thing to have to do, let me tell you.
Yeah. And I can't imagine. My wife and I, we've been talking, it's going to be really important for us as our daughter gets older. Like, you have to, she needs to understand the privilege that she has. And then, we also want to make sure that we're teaching her about, unconscious bias, because it's something that everybody has. And it's, how do you recognize that and work to catch yourself in those moments? And then, what are you going to do to help other people? When I started this podcast, I just wanted to have fun people on, and, I've had comedians and writers and stuff, just people I like having conversations with. And then as the world has kind of continued to move, it's like, I have to use this. We can still have fun, but we have to use it to make sure that we're lifting issues and bringing voices that need to be heard. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is just, it's something that needs to change. And when I think about you, I think of you almost as, it sounds cheesy, but I think of you as like the 300 warrior. You're kicking somebody in the pit, you know what I mean? Like just really out there working to make things better.
Wow, man, Sparta forever, Right.
Well, we've got about 15 minutes left. I know, you've got a heart out. And like I said, when you're a lawyer and you got to be in court and stuff like that, I'm definitely not going to keep you over. But I wanted to ask, so I want to talk about the film, because we've talked about, hey, that traffic stop could be, your last encounter with anyone ever, right? And I watched the movie, and it was, for folks that are listening, I think it's like 10 and a half minutes long. It's a short film. We're going to link it up in the show notes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts. I want people to watch it. It's one of the most powerful and compelling and heartbreaking. It's just so hard to explain without watching it. But for people who are listening, because I could kind of break it down, but it's not my story. So would you mind, I don't want to ruin any, too much for people that want to watch it, but can you kind of give a synopsis or an overview of your story and what the film captures?
Sure, absolutely. This is about an incident, myself and the Oakland Police Department, about 3 years ago, where I was essentially by myself driving down the street the day after Christmas. So it was about 7 o'clock at night. So, it's just starting to get dark. I literally had left home. I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to go to the grocery store, get a little food. I'm tired of leftovers. I've been eating Christmas, turkey for like for all the meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go get something. And so, when you're just kind of mindlessly driving, not doing anything, music wasn't up loud, I wasn't talking on the cell phone or anything like that. So I'm just going to the grocery store. And I noticed the reflection of a red light in the interior of my car, which caused me to look into the rear view. And when I did, I saw a police SUV like pretty close up on my bumper. And I was like, oh, wow, like if they've had this light on, I didn't notice it before they're right up on me. Let me just kind of pull to the side. I'm on a major street, in the city. Like, let me just pull to the side now so I can let them go around and let them go where they're getting to. I guess they have an emergency. And so when I just kind of angled my car towards the curb, to my surprise, and I was waiting on the SUV to go around, it didn't. It actually got right up on my bumper. And I'm looking, and as I look to the left, I hear a whole bunch of orders. Driver, get out the car right now. Driver, get out the car right now. And it's an intensity that I'll never forget because I'm sitting there and it startled me. I'm like, and when I look in the rear view, I could see the silhouette of an officer and I know the stance because this is what I do every day. I look at these videos as a civil rights attorney defending or prosecuting these cases against officers that do this. And I know the stance and he has his gun out. And at the same time, I kind of realize what's happening and that he has a gun on me and he's saying all this stuff on the right side, the passenger side, all of this is behind me off to the right. I hear them saying, put your hands up, don't you move. Put your hands up, don't you move. And right then and there, those are contradictory orders. And, every video that I've seen flashes before me and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I don't know what the hell I'm about to do. And so right then and there, I had to start negotiating my way out the car. And so it was a very tense moment. And I have all these emotions. I mean, if you're viewers and you may be able to appreciate it, if somebody's threatening you, it's like kind of fight or flight, especially with a gun. But at the same time, you're like, I can't fight. There's no flight or fleeing because either one of those are going to wind up getting me killed. But at the same time, these people are telling me to do something under threat of being shot. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And you're like, I didn't do anything. So you're also a little indignant. You're like, why are you doing this to me? What the hell's going on? Like, but that's the wrong time to channel any of those emotions.
Yeah, that's how let me tell you something, officer.
Right. You're staring down a barrel of not one gun, but several guns. So after I negotiated my way out, maybe get out the car, and which I did without getting shot. And they had me get on the ground, and I just thought it was going to be over there, but no, they had me, crawl on the ground backwards. And hey, I'm not an old geezer, but it had been a long time, especially if you ever have to do something like that when there's a gun pointed at your back or at your head. God. Yeah. You're scared to death, which is what I was. And the whole time I'm just like, if something happens here, who's going to tell my story? Like, am I going to be like the things we look at, on the news where it's like, well,
be on Instagram or Facebook tomorrow. And it's just like another thing. Yeah.
Subject to the debates that you're talking about where somebody's like, well, it looked like he put his hand towards his pocket, right. or he didn't get down quick enough. What did he expect the officer to do? The officer's scared. And to everyone listening, it's like the officer is scared, but the officer is the one with the gun and the training and the bulletproof vest, and he has backup, and this is what he's elected or he or she is elected to do,
Well, and not to mention that being a pizza delivery driver is statistically more dangerous than being a police officer. So if a pizza delivery driver can go years without shooting someone,
There you have.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's just
no. I mean, that's a good one. I hadn't heard that one, but yeah, I might incorporate that. So if you hear me saying that somewhere, you know where I got it from.
Check it, but I'm pretty sure it's true.
I will. I'll call Domino's after this, right?
Oh,
but so yeah. Anyway, long story short of it, I go through the procedures. They put me in handcuffs, put me in the back of a patrol car, only to tell me later that, hey, we did this because someone in a silver car. I was driving a silver Mercedes. Someone in a silver car flashed or brandished AK-47 early in the day in the city of Oakland. And it's like, okay, I'm not even in the city of Oakland right now. I'm in a nice, quote unquote, fancy Mercedes-Benz, top of the line. I know bad stuff happens in the world. Very few drive-bys or AK-47s are being bandied around in an S550 Mercedes-Benz. And more importantly to me, how I saw it as a lawyer and just as a regular person on the street. So do you mean to tell me that every silver car is getting pulled over under gunpoint?
I think I'm losing you. You might be blocking the microphone.
Oh,
you cut. Yeah, you cut out there for just a second. I wanted to make sure I didn't lose you. I think you were saying you're pulling over every silver car that's out there.
I knew that, they weren't going into Piedmont where I went to the night school, and they're not going into, other affluent parts of town, pulling over every person with a silver car with their guns blazing, telling them, to get out or get shot. Like, that's not happening. But, for whatever reason, they felt comfortable enough to do it to me, and they did it. And so I didn't just take it laying down, no pun intended, although they did have me laying down. I waited until I can get the odds more in my favor, where I had some rights, and I filed a complaint and a lawsuit, and was justified. The Police Citizens Review Board looked at it, the police looked at it, and they realized those officers violated my rights. And so, I survived to tell you this story today. Unfortunately, there's many people who have not survived, and there's even more people who did survive, but, are in the shadows because, they've been conditioned to think that's just how things go, and who's going to care. But, I'm here to do a few things with that movie. And, one of which is to bring the topic up so that people can understand and hopefully feel what that fear is like, and understand that when you see something like that happen or you read about it, it's not just blase. That is a serious situation. And to make people understand too, that, look, I was an attorney, okay? I wasn't doing anything. I'm not an ex-felon. I didn't have a charge pending. I wasn't a criminal suspect. I was just a law-abiding driver and got threatened within an inch of my life. So it can happen to anyone, and it does happen to certain groups of people. I happened to check the box, and they didn't care that I was an attorney. They didn't care that I had been suing them for 10, 15 years. It didn't matter. What mattered to them was comply or die. And that's not the way law enforcement should be.
Yeah, and I can almost kind of imagine that if it was an officer who was aware of the fact that you have been suing them for 10 or 15 years, that might, if you got one of those officers, it might even add like an extra level of like, oh man, like this guy knows who I am. He knows what I do. I mean, I might be way out there, but it's just, if someone was coming after me repeatedly, I could see holding a little bit of a grudge there.
That definitely crossed my mind, and you'll never really know what's in a person's mind, which is why, the question you posed earlier about weeding people out who are racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever their ism is that drives them to treat a person or a group of people in a bad way. How do you figure that out? You have to take different things from their lives. And so, when you groups or social media groups, closed groups, where people are saying, all this bad stuff and they're police officers. I mean, to me, it's not just, oh my gosh, they put that on a social media post, how dare them? To me, it's how many times has that mind state penetrated and influenced the way in which they treated somebody? Did they write that ticket? Did they just pull somebody over? Did they use force? Did they put the handcuffs extra tight? Did they leave out things that would be helpful to that person? We have to really examine the way in which they've gone about policing in our name. Because remember, they're public servants, so they should be held accountable to the public.
Yeah, you're getting money from my tax dollars. I think a lot of people forget that you work for me, and
exactly.
It's crazy too, because there's a lot of times where like they will intentionally try to violate your rights and just hope that you don't know enough to like not incriminate yourself, or you know what I mean? Like they know how to play the game. It's a chessboard of how can I get you to admit something that I can either give you a ticket for or take you in for, and it's just, I don't know, man, it's beyond messed up, and I'm super glad that, number one, you came out of that situation unharmed, unscathed, able to go home to your kids. And number two, that, the police board sided with you, because I think that's another thing that gets very frustrating, is there's so many times where you see cops who are charged and they're acquitted, or we bring somebody in and it doesn't go the way that it should. So I'm definitely glad that everything worked out. And I know you've got to go again. I want to make sure that I'm being respectful, but before I let you go, there's all sorts of things out there. 8 can't wait for police reform, and I mean, you can just do a simple Google search and find places where you can donate to try to help and things like that. But sometimes it can be overwhelming. So, from someone who is in it and living it, what are some ways? Are there organizations that people listening can donate to? Is there like a grassroots way that people can help? And just like the last minute or so, I mean, anything that you would suggest as far as being able to get behind?
Yeah, fundamentally, there aren't any other, what do I say, professions that have as much power and influence that have no one regulating them other than themselves. Okay, and so, or no one that has that much power and influence, and they're not required to have transparency. So the thing is right now, police departments are really regulated by the state. So each state has its own patchwork of stuff. And then locally, in that individual department, they kind of they're allowed to regulate their own individual officers. So because of that, it's such a patchwork of rules. There's no uniformity in the way things are done. So, and there isn't even a national, if you will, organization that's set up to just regulate policing in our country. There's groups, but none of them actually have the teeth. They bark, but they don't have the teeth that's needed by legislation. So I say all that to say, wherever your viewers and listeners are at, it's on a local, a state, and a federal level that there needs to be activity. On a local level, arguing for, lobbying your city council person, your supervisor, your mayor, to have a citizens police review board is important. There needs to be an independent set of eyes that look at what the police do and whether or not it's right and correct, and they should be doing it in our name. I think it's a fundamental flaw that we have district attorneys or attorney generals who are tasked with evaluating whether or not a cop broke a law, when these are the same cops that are their coworkers that they go to lunch with every day, that they rely upon to get criminal convictions. It's hard. I mean, it would be very hard for you, I'd imagine, to fire your wife from her job, right? Like, whoa, I gotta see you tomorrow, or I gotta see you tonight, that's an inherent conflict. And then at the same time, looking at it from going up to the next level, statewide level, if they won't do it nationally, it certainly should be statewide. There needs to be a statewide database of registry of cops, where you can look and figure out what their complaint history is, where you can look and figure out what departments they've been to, and whether or not they killed somebody or hurt somebody. I mean, we would not, as a society, allow surgeons to go from hospital to hospital with botched surgeries and a string of deaths behind them, or a string of complaints for acting inappropriate in the surgery or in the operating room, and think that that was okay. You would want to know if your surgeon is known to have done X, Y, and Z, or even has a reputation for it, even if it was found to be true or not. Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So, but we don't have that, and that makes absolutely no sense. So those are the type of changes. And then as it relates to grassroots organizing, it's grassroots. And so, being aware, keeping the conversation going. And these are tough conversations to have sometimes with people. And I get it. It makes people uncomfortable. But, we're never going to grow. We're never going to progress as a society until we open our eyes and tell each other there is no Santa Claus, that it's really us. Okay. So until that's done, we're going to keep being the little kid who believes in a fairy tale, expecting presents and somebody to eat the cookie and drink the milk for us, when really no one's coming to do that, okay? So, for the people who are out there looking at how to get involved, I'm sure there's people there in your local community and the state level who are about police reform, who are about police accountability, and that's what this is about. This is a human issue. It's even bigger than black or white. This is a human issue, human rights, man. We frown our nose upon other countries that lock up political dissidents or people who criticize their government. We look down on it. We tout our country as being a democracy and having freedoms. The problem is that everyone doesn't enjoy the same freedom, even though we're all being supposedly held under up to the standard of the same law. That's fundamentally unfair. And so there's a social contract that our country has made with each person. And that social contract, you're supposed to be free, You're supposed to have rights, and you aren't supposed to be persecuted for exercising those rights. Right now, that's not happening. And so anybody that's on the side of justice, I need you to get active. I need you to educate yourself, and I need you to do significant work towards making our country live up to the idols, to the principles that we love and hold dear, freedom, justice, and equality for all.
I mean, I think that's the perfect place to wrap it, man. I think that says it all. And I just, again, Adante Pointer, so happy that you were able to take the time and come in. Just thank you so much. Thank you for spreading the awareness. Thank you, for telling your story in the film, and thank you for fighting every day, man. I like I said, I just feel blessed to have you come hang for a little bit. So,
hey, man, wonderful, wonderful conversation. I love what you do. I support what you do. And, it's so important to have platforms and people such as yourself, because we're all ambassadors to our social circles, and we're influencers in our own right. You don't have to be, a Kardashian to be an influencer. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not.
Although no one would confuse us with one, but
right, yeah. I don't have that build, man. No one's putting a bottle of champagne on this. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, there you go.
But guys, that has been episode 33. Please check out Dead Right. We'll put the link in the show notes. Again, just thank you so much for being here. Can you hang out for just a minute after we wrap up?
Sure.
Awesome. All right, guys, thank you so much. We will see you next week for episode 34. Adante, again, thank you for being here, man.
Peace.